Okay, so this is devICT for Thursday, October 25th, 2017. So if this is your first time here, I just want to tell you a little bit about us. devICT, this is a community for software developers. Our mission is to educate, empower, and connect software developers in the Wichita area. That's any kind of software. So we have a lot of people that do web or games or desktop stuff or mainframes or just hobby stuff or whatever. If you're interested in software, developing it, and you're in the Wichita area, we want you to be part of the group. We have a code of conduct that we take very seriously. If you have any questions or concerns, please come to me, let me know. Our full code of conduct is available on our website, devict.org/conduct. I'm going to just kind of highlight a couple of ways you can be involved. The best way to be involved is to get on our Slack team. There's somebody in there every day talking about something or other, sometimes tech-related. It's a good resource where you can go and ask questions or offer help or just kind of talk about whatever. If you go to devict.org, there's a link at the top where you can get an invite onto the Slack team. You can also, on that website, watch past presentations. This is being recorded. We try to record as many as we can, and we put them up there for, posterity, I guess. Another way to be involved is to donate. Membership in an organization is free, and our events are almost always free as well, but donations are appreciated because we have some monthly costs. It comes to about $100 a month, and right now we have recurring monthly donations at about $110 a month, so we're in the black, which is great. More smaller donations are very much appreciated so that the cost is distributed over more people. If one of those $110 donation, then now we're not in black anymore. So if I get a lot of $5 people, that's great. That's what I want. So that again, you can go to our devict.org/support. There's a link there where you can donate. One way to be involved is to give a talk. This is a great way to learn about a topic that you're interested in. This is a low-pressure, low-key environment. So if you think that you want to learn about Kubernetes and you want to give a talk on Kubernetes, then just tell me you want to give a talk on Kubernetes, and I'll put you on the schedule, and then now you have a month to learn it. Just for example. Some people also like to use these kind of meetup events as a place to practice a talk that they want to pitch to a local or regional or national conference. So this is another way to get practice for that. We run a mentorship program. This is at devict.org/mentors. It's pretty low key. We're just trying to be an avenue for mentors to connect with mentees. If you're interested in becoming a mentor, just let me know. It's really easy to get your name on the list. If you're looking for a mentor, go to the website and pick one and send them a message. There's a lot of people on this list. Just quick shout outs to some of our friends. There's MakeICT. devICT is actually a MakeICT program. They are Wichita's maker community. Check them out, makeict.org. They're actually having an auction tomorrow night. If you're interested, not doing anything, you want to go check out some cool locally made stuff. There's Women Who Code, the Wichita chapter. We work with them a lot on events. Open Wichita is Wichita. Like I say, the devICT is more about education, and Open Wichita is more about actually doing stuff. They have a bunch of programs and projects they're working on to try and make Wichita a better place in some way. WULUG is Wichita State Linux Users Group. You don't have to be a student to attend. Startup Wichita and Shocker Startup are two entrepreneurial startup-based groups if you're looking to connect with that crowd. And then we have Wichtalks, the quarterly Ignite format, super awesome lightning talk event. All right, upcoming events. Every Monday night here at the Labor Party, we run an event called Study Hall. It's a time and a place where you can come and work on whatever you want to work on, bring your own homework kind of thing. People will be available, ask questions, try and get connected with somebody else. We do that Mondays in the evenings. Code and Coffee is every Thursday in the mornings. So that's, again, here at Labor Party. Just the idea is maybe before you go to a day job, come here and work on something like personal project. Not really doing the hangout anymore. We do have Game Dev Potluck, which is the second Saturday of every month. Same kind of deal as Code and Coffee, but it's a little bit more focused on games, and it's more like all day. And it's potluck, so bring food or Doesn't really matter. Just come hang out. We try to run the Java Talk on the third Tuesday of the month, and that's over at the High Touch building. And then we have this event, which we run on the last Thursday of every month. And before I'm done, I want to just quickly point out that we are in the month of October, which means it's currently Hacktoberfest. You got about 5 days left. If you haven't already participated in this event, it's pretty cool. There is a global event happening through DigitalOcean and GitHub, where if you submit 4 PRs to any open repository on GitHub and you fill out their little form, then you get a t-shirt and some stickers. It's like, great. And we also are running the Wichita Hacktoberfest at the same time, which is basically the same thing, but we have a list of Wichita-based projects. So if you can do 4 PRs against Wichita projects, in the next 5 days, then you get a t-shirt and probably some stickers, and it'll be great. So check it out, and I'll tweet out the link to that site again here in a little bit. Tonight's event, we have Term Leech. Chuck Haynes is going to be talking to us about VueJS, the good, the better, and the best. Let's give him a round of applause while I get his slides up on this. And then we want to come over here, and where do we start? Where do we click? Okay,
just found that out.
Cool. And then we still need to go back here. Screen share, screen 2. Okay. You're good to go. Take it away, Jacob.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. All right. So like Jacob said, my name is Chuck Haynes. Just got a quick background on me. I've been doing software development professionally now for about 18 years. I've worked in just about every industry. I've worked for the government. I worked in private. I've worked in public. I've even tried a couple startups. Obviously, I'm not on a beach in Cancun, so they didn't do very well. I've done back end, I've done front end, I've done embedded, so I've kind of run the gambit. My kind of current focus, I consider myself a full stack developer, although I tend more towards the front end of stuff. It's kind of where I've landed with my current jobs. So what we're going to talk about today is Vue.js. Some of you guys may be familiar with this, some of you guys may not. Vue.js has exploded in popularity over the last year. We'll talk about a little bit later about actually some statistics on it that have come out recently. But it's kind of one of the big 3 frameworks. When I say the big 3, everyone knows React, that's by Facebook. Everyone knows AngularJS, Google's behind that. Vue.js actually doesn't have a company behind it, but there is enough donations that the developer who works on it does actually focus on it as his full-time job. So some people might be a little weary of that. But based on the community around it, it's certainly exploding in popularity, and a lot of people are choosing it. And we're going to talk about, kind of the basics of it tonight, why I chose it, why I like it, and kind of some of the things around it. So what is Vue.js? Well, if you look actually on the website, they call themselves the Progressive JavaScript Framework. They kind of have 3 main things that they actually talk about front and center on their website. One is approachable. What they mean by that, and we'll go into detail on these a little bit more, is if you already know HTML, you already know CSS, and you already know JavaScript, you can program the Vue.js framework. It's very, very easy to pick up, especially if you don't have to learn how to do the Vue.js way of things or certain things. It's for the most part plain HTML and plain JavaScript. It's versatile. It's an incredibly adaptable ecosystem. So Vue.js itself considers itself to be the V in MVVM. So it is not a complete framework by itself. Now, certainly you could use it by itself, but typically you're going to build it with some other things from its ecosystem, like Vuex for a centralized state management, or Vue Router for your single page architectures and routing from the front end. And it's performant. It has a blazing fast virtual DOM. There's very little optimization that you have to do manually when you're using Vue.js. Out of the box is extremely performant. It actually beats React out of the box when it comes to performance in most scenarios. Now, you can certainly make React more performant if you know what you're doing, but out of the box is what most people are looking for from an experience. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Vue.js. The first commit was actually was June 22nd, 2013. At that time, it was actually called Seed. It became Vue itself in December of 2013. The first time that the public actually used it, which was Vue.js 0.8, was actually in February. Now, it eventually became the actual 1.0 release. But 1.0 compared to 2.0 or 2.53, I think they're up to now, is fundamentally different. It's actually almost as different as Angular 1 and Angular 2. That's how much of a difference they made when they came out with VueJS. So when VueJS was in kind of its 1.0 release, some people used it, maybe some people who were interested in Angular 1. But for the most part, it kind of had a lot of the same things Angular 1 had. Then VueJS 2 came out, and that's when it took off and exploded in popularity. At the time it was released, like I talked about before, it considers itself the V in the MVVM or the MVC architecture, whichever you want to refer to. Yes, they are different, but they're similar enough for this purpose. Really, Vue started to take off when the Laravel community really got involved in it, really pushed for it. The Laravel community is pretty big, and they took a very, very interest in Vue. And right about the time that 2.0 came out, Laravel was really putting out in their Laracasts a lot of things on Vue.js and Vuex and all those kind of things. And I think that really, really is where it started taking off, when they kind of got kind of a bigger player in the game. That even though Laravel is not necessarily a front-end framework, it's a big player in the PHP space. Them and Symfony, they're pretty big players in that space. With the release of Vue Router, Vue CLI, Vuex, and a ton of other plugins, the Vue ecosystem is really now more than just the V. You can just use the V if you want. And for those of you guys who aren't familiar, I apologize. The V in MVVM stands for Vue. So it's actually the Vue layer. So what you're actually physically going to see when you go to a website. They've now dubbed themselves the progressive framework, much kind of like the idea behind React. React considers itself mostly the Vue, right? You typically don't just use React. You're probably going to use Redux or Flux or something like that, or RxJS. You're probably going to use React Router to really get that kind of rich ecosystem. But it's not an opinionated framework like AngularJS 4. Is that what they're up to now, I think? Where when you buy into AngularJS, you buy into the way that they want you to do things. You're getting everything out of the box. So to me, I like kind of the React and the Vue approach, and the fact that you can kind of pick and choose what you want. You have a lot of options, and you glue it together. It all glues together really, really easily, and then you have this really rich ecosystem. So we talked a little bit earlier about the statistics. Vue.js is one of the most popular 3 JavaScript frameworks, like I said, alongside the giants like React and Angular. If you actually look over there on the GitHub, it does have over 71,000 stars on GitHub. Now some people are thinking, who cares about stars on GitHub? But that's typically a pretty good indication of how popular something is on GitHub, the number of stars it has, or you can see how many actual forks it has as well. So that's typically a pretty good indication, especially in the open source world. It was actually the most starred project on GitHub in 2016, and that's not just among JavaScript frameworks. So that's not just among front-end stuff. That was every single project on GitHub. Vue.js was the #1 starred project in 2016. There was a state of JavaScript that came out last year. This year's hasn't actually come out yet. I think I just got the email to take the survey. Vue.js actually had an 89% satisfaction rating among the developers who actually used it. It actually was second, only barely to React, which had 92%. So one of the things that I thought was interesting from this report is they said, I think it's fair to say that React and Vue are in a class of their own. Now, what else was on this report? Angular was on the report, Backbone, Ember, a lot of the popular frameworks you've probably heard of, they were all on this report. And what this report found out is that React and Vue, from real developers that they surveyed, those by and far, not only were they the most commonly used, they had the highest satisfaction rating among developers. And developers saying, yeah, I'm going to keep using this framework. It really is doing what I want it to do. And in the recently released that State of Vue.js report, I think I've linked it in the general chat a couple days ago. There was a State of Vue.js report that came out. I want to say it was earlier this week. It was done by a third-party company, and basically what they did is they went out into the Vue world. People are using Vue. Big companies like Adobe, GitLab, some of these big names that are actually using Vue. and did some case studies on some of the actual companies, but also did some developer studies. What they found out is that a whopping 95% of the respondents said that they would absolutely use VueJS for their next project. So we talked about that original slide, those 3 core components that VueJS really talks about itself. The first one it talks about is approachable. What it means by that is Vue's extremely easy to pick up. If you're even a novice JavaScript developer, even a beginner, I would say, and you know the basics of HTML and maybe know some CSS or you know some Sass or less or whatever the case might actually be, you already know everything that you need to know to build your first VueJS application. It can be literally as easy as just dropping in the actual VueJS onto an HTML page and going about your business. That's as easy as it is. Now, certainly it has, Webpack or Browsify if you want to use some of those other tools, and I would actually encourage it because you get a much richer ecosystem in that. But the point here is VueJS is so simple, you don't need any build tools at all. If we compare this to React, I will do a little bit of comparisons to React during the presentation here. Some people are kind of interested. I am not a React expert. I won't even claim to be one. I haven't used React in about 6 months. So if any of you guys are more familiar with React, and I do misspeak, please speak up and correct me, because this was just based on kind of what I had done about 6 months ago, as well as kind of what I've read recently. So you compare that to React, and React, you can't just drop React on a page and start using it, right? You got to learn typically JSX, right? That's what, now you can do plain HTML, but but out of the box, React wants you to use JSX, right? So now you got to learn something new if you want to use React. They really want you to use ES6. You can use ES5, you certainly can, but they really are pushing you towards ES6. So now you got to learn ES6, which doesn't even work on all the browsers. So what that means is now you've got to learn Babel and how to transpile your applications down to ES5, especially if you're going to support IE or Firefox or some of these things that don't support all the ES6 standards yet. CSS. The React world is really moving towards this styled component notation, which is this really weird like hybrid JavaScript CSS, which is kind of weird to me, right? So there's something else you're going to learn, right, if you want to pick up React. And not to mention, you just kind of have to learn the React way of doing things, right? So you got to learn about the render, right? The render function and how to deliver that out. You got to learn about the React.component, how to actually structure your application, set state, to manage state management. I think that was one of the biggest things that caught me when I first used React, is the fact that if I change a variable, like, just figure it out and update it, right? I don't want to have to tell React when to update something. And then the infamous, which we'll talk about a little bit later, should component update, I think, is what you have to implement if you really want to get that performance out of React, right? And that's not to say you can't, right? There's plenty of people that absolutely love it. They do great things in it, and it's awesome, right? Me personally, talk about them, picking up React and learning it. I can honestly say I think React was one of the hardest things I ever learned. Now, I tried to learn React and Redux and Immutable.js and probably too much at one time, but that's what React wants you to use. So why not learn it all at once, right? So VueJS is really about being approachable and simplistic and really, really easy to use. What we'll talk about here in a few later slides is, what does a basic Vue component look like, right? Vue is a component-based architecture, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later, similar to React. Everything's a component. That's how you build things. Going along with the approachable, one of the official things from Vue is what's called Vue CLI. Vue CLI offers a Yemen-like generator for building out your new VueJS applications. So you run Vue CLI, you say, do you want Redux? I'm sorry, do you want Vuex? Yeah, I'd like that. Do you want Vue Router? Yeah, I'll take that. Do you want to use Mocha for your testing library? Yeah, okay, cool. You want to use Nightwatch.js for end-to-end? Yeah, that sounds good, right? We should all be doing our testing, right? But really the full power here is it is 100% customizable. So it doesn't use Yemen specifically, but it's the same idea, right? You can write your own custom templates, your own custom plugins. So if you work for a large company and you want to put together a base package that you want your developers to use at a company, you can do that. If you compare that to Create React App, which they do have, React has made some, the community has made some real good strides in trying to bootstrap, and there's tons of boilerplates out there. So I won't even go on the boilerplates because they exist across the board. But if you want some customization, right, that's what we're all into. Maybe that's the whole point of these frameworks, React and Vue specifically. What I'm talking about here is you want to pick and choose what you want to use for your application, because you don't want this gigantic Titanic boat if you don't need it, right? Let's use a rowboat if that's all we need. The Create React app doesn't currently, or last time I looked, offer customizations. That could have changed. They might allow it now, but last time I looked, they hadn't. Also, the Create React app assumes that you're using a single-page architecture. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with single-page architecture, and if you are, you can tune me out for about a minute and a half here. Single-page architectures differ from traditional apps in the fact that all of your routing happens client-side. So once you load that initial JavaScript up in your browser, we're not going back to the server at all to view another page. It's all client. That's what we start talking about, client-side routing. Most modern frameworks assume that's what you're going to do, but not all applications are built that way. There's been plenty of companies I've worked at where we still do server-side rendering in something like Twig or something like that, and then we boot Vue up on top of it, and we're not a single-page architecture. So one of the downsides to the React app here is it assumes you're doing that single-page architecture. So if you want to use this to kind of bootstrap your app, you're kind of stuck in that mentality. And like we said before, it doesn't offer those user-built templates. So Vue uses what's called a single file component. Oh, yeah, I guess, okay. Some of my slides just got mixed up here, but that's all right. This over your right-hand side there is what a typical Vue component looks like, right? Vue is a component-based architecture. So what we mean by that, much like React, and Angular 4, is a component-based architecture as well. Everything that you write is a component that has a custom HTML tag associated with it, and that's what you actually insert into your DOM to render that component. So Vue does what they call single file components, which is to say that everything that you need to develop this component is comprised in a single file. So there's three main parts to the actual file here. At the top, you can see the template. Now, one thing you're going to notice about Vue here is that's just plain HTML. There's no special JavaScript tags or JSX tags. Although Vue does support JSX, if that's your thing, it supports it out of the box, and you're more than welcome to do it that way. But me, like I said, I'm a simple guy. I like just plain HTML. Those of you guys who are a little bit familiar with Angular 1, this might look a little bit familiar to you guys, because the way that Vue works is it actually does use directives and things within the HTML to actually do things like binding to your model or binding to click events or those kind of things. The next main part that you'll see there is the actual script. This is all of your JavaScript for your component. So this is where you're going to do things like, bind into your Vuex store if that's what you're going to use, or have your local data model here. You're going to talk about defining your props. You can see here in this case we've defined that we have a prop that's a string. That's actually shorthand for a prop that's a string that's not required. There is actually a longhand notation where you can do things like say this is a type of a string, it's required, here's my validation for this prop. So you can actually even do custom validations in there, and you can also give it a default value. So React might have changed a little bit, but when I was using React, you kind of define your props, and then you kind of, at the end, you're like this.prop type, and you kind of give it some attributes at the end. So you're kind of hopping around in your code to actually look at your props and your validation. And, to me, it's kind of nicer just to have it all there. It's got all full lifecycle events, and we'll talk about the lifecycle here in just a little bit. And at the top there is actually the name. So app there is the actual name of your component. So if you're going to reference that component within HTML, you'd use a tag that was called app. And then finally at the end here, what you're actually going to notice is actually all of your CSS for this particular component. So Vue really encourages you to have all your CSS in your component. They actually even encourage you to do something called scoped CSS or CSS modules. And I think I talk about that a little bit more later, so I won't get into it too much. But basically what that allows you to do is very much apply the cohesion principles of your CSS here is only related to this component and is not related to anything else in your ecosystem. So you're only focused on this component. That really drives you towards reusable components. So let's dive into some of these things a little bit more that we talked about before. So we talked about the template. The template is nothing more than HTML5 with some special sauce. We've got things like the directives we talked about. It can do interpolation. So if you have a variable within your data, and we'll talk about data here next in the script, that you want to expose out, you can use interpolation. You can use the mustache-style, squigglies there, whatever you call those things. You can do VHTML. The other interesting thing that I found is by default, Vue is two-way bound, or well, in this case, one-way binding. So any changes I would make to my data model are going to immediately get reflected out into the HTML. Now, there's a performance cost anytime you do that. So they actually do have another tag called v_once, which essentially, if those of you guys are familiar with Angular 1, this was the old, I think it was a colon or something like that, the bind once, right? So once this has a value, it will display it to the screen and it will unhook all of its reactivity from it. So you can get some performance gains if you're just really worried about that first time that variable gets changed. It supports attributes. So you can see some of the attributes here. There's basically two ways to do attributes. One is to actually spell it out and do v-bind. So what this actually means is we're binding this class to a variable named variable in our script somewhere. The other, and you'll probably see this a lot more frequently, that's the shorthand notation, and that's just to use the colon there. It means the same thing, just a little less terminology. It does support event binding. Click events and load events, any kind of event that can be emitted, you can actually bind it into your script tags. The longhand notation is using the v_on, like that. The shorthand notation is just using the @ symbol. Typically, you see a lot of people use the @ symbol because we're all developers, we're lazy, we like to type the least amount of things possible. And directives, we talked about those, vshow, vif, v4, a lot of your typical things if you're iterating over stuff or want to show or hide things. All those kind of things. Some of you guys who are familiar with Angular 1, you're going to kind of go, oh, hey, look, I know all about that kind of stuff, because it shares a lot of that. And then we have modifiers. So a lot of times you may want to prevent the default, right? So a lot of times what would you do? Pass the event object in and event.prevent default. Well, that's all baked in. You can do .prevent. You can do there's a couple other modifiers that I can't think of off the top of my head. Submitting a form, you can do, to prevent a form from submitting it, so you tell it to submit, all those kind of things. So next thing we're going to talk about is the actual script tags. This is kind of the meat and potatoes, right? This is where you do everything. What you're going to notice here, though, is it's really just plain old JavaScript. I mean, those of you guys who are from, this happens to be ES6, but those of you guys who are familiar with ES6, we're doing some imports. We're just exporting defaults and just throwing some things out there, right? Pretty easy, pretty simple. JavaScript, I think it's pretty easy to pick that kind of stuff up. Some of the main things that you'll see here, some of the things that a React component is going to expect you to expose out in your script is actually the name of the component. And this uses camel case notation. So for example, if this were app name with a capital N, that would translate to app-name HTML. HTML standard actually doesn't support camel case, it only supports dashes. A lot of browsers don't care and they'll let you do it, but that's actually not technically part of the HTML standard. One of the biggest learning curves coming from React to this world is in JSX and React, everything's camel cased when you're actually writing it. Props, talked about props. Everyone's familiar with props. That's when you're actually passing data into your actual component itself. Data, that's the stuff that we actually want to expose out as pure data elements to the actual template tags. Computed values are actually, they're in the form of a function and return values, but they're actually cached. So if you have things like, let's say you want to do a full name of a person, right? You make a computed thing that says full name and returns first name plus last name. The really cool thing about computed is Vue is smart enough to cache those and only tell the DOM to update things when those values actually change. So it's smart enough to not like constantly hit the computed value to see if it changed. Vue's smart enough to figure that kind of stuff out. Created, that's one of the lifecycle hooks. We'll talk about the lifecycle hooks here in just a little bit. And then you have methods. Methods are just actions you want to basically expose out to your template there for clicking, submitting a form, onload events, any of that kind of stuff. And then finally we have style. Styles are just plain CSS if you want. Now, Vue will also support Sass, SCSS, Less, Stylus. Is that one a new one? Or oh my God, I'm not confused. It supports quite a few of them, right? So pick your poison and kind of use whatever you want to use. You can kind of see at the top here, we have, and at the bottom, we just have some basic CSS. There's two kind of distinct differences here. You can just do straight up CSS if you want, and you just do the style tag, and if you gave it a class name, that class is actually going to be globally available anywhere in your application. Because at build time, what will actually happen is, if you're using Webpack, it will actually extract out all your CSS and shove it into a CSS file for you. What most people will typically use is either scope CSS or CSS modules. So what scope CSS actually does is it will scope this CSS so that when it ends up getting generated at compile time, it gives it some kind of random number. You can see the data-v blah, blah, blah there. Basically, what that ensures is that this class that you're defining in this component will only affect this component that you in this specific thing. So you can prevent your global namespace collisions, or that whole, which I've been in when we used Less before, where you got to do 10 overrides because somewhere higher up in the DOM you decided that black was a great color or something, and now you want it white. Things like that. The other thing that you can also do is CSS modules. CSS modules are pretty similar to scope CSS. The only difference is, whereas scope CSS, you would just use the standard like classicals app, and it would do that. With CSS modules, you actually bind your class to style.app, and it figures it out from there. So a little bit different. Scope CSS can actually affect children, which is one of the benefits of it. So if you did want to kind of have children styled within a higher level component, which I'd actually argue against, you could do that with CSS modules. So we talked about the component lifecycle. So this is, from start to finish, the lifecycle for a Vue component. Pretty similar to React. There's a lot of similarities in a lot of cases. All the red things are the actual lifecycle hooks that you can hook into in your component. So if you want to fire something before it's created, or when it's created, or when it's mounted, some common examples of this are if I need to make an AJAX call to get something back from the back end of my component. Well, I might shove that in the before created so that it can fire off as fast as possible, so that hopefully my back end's fast enough that by the time the component's rendered, the data's already back. So those are some examples of things that you might actually do. DOM manipulation. DOM manipulation is actually okay in Vue components. They have a special ref tag that you use that allows you to actually reference your DOM elements, so you don't have to do like document get element by or anything like that. They've kind of got that baked in. So maybe you want to do some actual DOM manipulations. That's all perfectly acceptable too. So we talked about approachability. Now let's talk about versatile. So what do we mean by versatile? What we mean by that is Vue itself, we talked about this before, it's the V and MVVM. Model, Vue, Vue model, or MVC, for those of you guys that might be familiar with that. So much like React, out of the box, if you just use Vue, you're just getting the Vue. You're just getting the V there. You're just getting the binding back and forth, the showing stuff to people, that kind of stuff. It's really when you start adding additional things from its rich ecosystem, much like React, this is where they're actually very similar in nature, where you really start to get the power of the ecosystem. So some examples of some things that you may choose and are fairly common to choose. Vue Router. We talked about that client-side routing, that SPA type architecture. Vue CLI, we talked about that, the easy spin up. Vue Loader, that's actually the Webpack loader for Vue. What that will actually let you do is there's single page components that we talked about that will actually extract out the templates into HTML. It'll actually extract out the script into JavaScript. It'll extract out the CSS into CSS files. So when you're delivering up to the client, you've got HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It takes care of all that for you. Vuex is state management, unidirectional data flow, Redux, Flux. You guys are familiar with that. Same idea. Whole lot easier though. Vue test utils this is actually a brand new one that just came out about a week ago. This is making testing a first-class citizen in Vue. This is an entire set of things to be able to test your Vue components with either Jest or Mocha, Karma, pick your poison. I've become a Jest fan recently, and we use this pretty heavily. It allows you to do things like mocking and actually looking at the resultant rendered HTML, all of that kind of stuff. And Nuxt. Nuxt is actually an opinionated framework for server-side rendering. So Vue does support server-side rendering, much like React does. Nuxt is kind of a very opinionated way of doing it. There's a few different ways that you can do server-side rendering in Vue. Nuxt happens to be one of the most popular ones. We talked about performance. It does have a virtual DOM. So what that means is that basically it has a shadow copy of the DOM that it's able to intelligently figure out exactly what part of the DOM down to the text node that it actually needs to re-render when changes happen. So this actually makes it super performant and a little bit different from React because React actually requires the entire component to re-render itself. So if you have a fairly large component in React, that entire component actually has to re-render itself when there's any data changes. The difference in Vue is even if you have a large component, Vue can go down to the text node and actually only re-render that part of the actual DOM. So it's super performant out of the box in that way. You don't have to do anything to get that level of performance. VueJS's runtime out of the box is optimized to be, in most cases, not all cases, and I'll kind of talk about a few edge cases here in a minute, but out of the box it's designed to be more performant than React. It fully optimizes the re-renders, like we talked about there. And the other thing with Vue is the dependency model is all built in. It's smart enough to know about all that. In React, if you really want to get that level of performance out of your component, you're probably using the, either a pure component, which I think is a relatively new thing, I could be wrong, or you're manually implementing that should component update to really tell React when it needs to re-render that component. So you really kind of have to get in the weeds and really figure it out. Whereas Vue, it figures it all out for you, and it's actually really good at it. The last thing we talk about here is the component dependencies are automatically tracked. We just talked about that. Vue's smart enough to know, like down to the the minutia levels, what changes when it changes, and only have to respond to that actual code change. And we talked about the should component update stuff. So with that being said, that's kind of a lot about Vue. I'm actually I have a couple slides here. I actually want to show you a couple things with Vuex. And the reason being is unidirectional data patterns is kind of what most people are moving to in the front end world, right? For those of you guys who aren't familiar with unidirectional data patterns, essentially it's a store pattern. Everything goes through the store, and the store propagates out the changes. So it's a single source of truth for all changes to your data models. Some of the advantages of that are you know exactly where everything's being changed at. Unlike the Angular 1 world where things are changing all over the place and sometimes you have no idea where something's changed. So this has been fully embraced by React with Redux and Flux, and there's a whole bunch of kind of implementations. Typically, if you're using React, you're going to use one of those two almost always. Vue is kind of similar in the fact that if you're using Vue for a large application, you're probably going to use Vuex. which is the state management pattern for Vue. This is kind of the official unidirectional data flow. Vue actually does support Redux. So if you're a masochist and you like Redux, then you're more than welcome to actually go and implement it and use it. And so, you know, talk about unidirectional data flow, centralized store, mutations for changing state. So there's only a single type of thing that can change state, and that's mutations. You've got your actions, which are kind of your asynchronous data calls and those kind of things. You've got getters. One of the things I really, really like about VueX is this notion of modules. And we compare this a little bit to Redux. Redux is a giant store, right? So everything is in the big store. No matter whether I'm talking about a car or an icebox, if it's in my application, it's in the same store. VueX takes things a little bit differently. Instead, they have this notion of modules. It actually still subscribes to the centralized store, but allows you to break the store down into submodules so that you can really think about just within the scope of a module. One of the other things I think, at least for me, that this benefits is that Redux has its benefits with the global store, but you have to be thinking about everything all the time. Whereas with the module pattern, I'm only caring about the icebox, or I'm only caring about the car and the actions that are actually flowing through those particular things. And it has a rich plugin system. You can write plugins for it and do all kinds of things. So a typical VueX example. This is, on your left here, actually what a module would look like in VueX. So you can see we've actually got all our actions there. Actions are our AJAX, typically AJAX calls. In this case, just to give you an example, I happen to just commit something. We've got getters. We've got our mutations, which actually change state. And then we actually have our state at the bottom. That's a full VueX store. And then over on the right is actually how we would instantiate it. So we instantiate the VueX store, and then we tell it what modules it uses. So we're, I think, kind of close to time here. So take any questions, comments, flames, you know, hey, your presentation stunk, whatever. And I'll be happy to answer it. And then if we have a couple minutes, I'll show you. I have an example app here. I'll put up on GitHub. It's a very simple to-do app, and just kind of walk through a few quick things when I have a couple minutes, and then we'll go from there. So questions, comments, anything? Yep.
How do you decide when you use VueX and when not to reach for VueX?
Will you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question was, how do you decide to use VueX, or when would you actually use it? That's a good question. So I would say pretty much any, I want to say large application, any application that's more than 1 or 2 pages, I would probably go for VueX. The reason being is the benefits, you know, you lose a little bit of performance with anytime you add another library in Vuex or Redux or anything like that. But I think the maintainability that you get from using it far outweighs that. So the fact that, you know, let's take a to-do example, right? Okay, so we have a to-do store where we're gonna, you know, add a new to-do that we want to do. Well, maybe you have a quick way of adding a to-do, you know, a little component where you just hit enter and it adds a to-do. Maybe you've got another form where it's a much more complex version of the to-do. Well, in that case, you know, using something like VueX makes sense because those components don't have to know about each other at all. All they have to know about is I have a to-do store that handles how many to-dos do I have, adding a to-do, marking to-dos as done, and all they care about is they subscribe to the actual events. They tell the store, hey, mark this to-do as done, then the store will actually propagate those things out. So it really helps you decouple your components. So I think anytime where you're going to have multiple components that may share bits of information, that's a great opportunity to use VueX.
Are there any real core advantages of just using Vue? If I'm just interested to use this as a Vue, is there enough advantage of using it? And yeah, are there inherent advantages of any of those?
Sure. So the question was, is there any advantages to just using Vue as the view? Absolutely. So some of the things that Vue is going to give you just using the view part of it. So let's take out everything else, and let's just talk about binding data elements into HTML and out of HTML. So let's think about how we would maybe do that in jQuery, right? We'd have to bind to the input. We'd have to grab the element. We'd have to put it somewhere. If we made some programmatic change, we'd have to populate it back out, right? Vue's going to handle that all automatically for us by binding to what it refers to as the V model, which Angular, if you're familiar with that, it's very similar. By just binding that element to a variable within your JavaScript, you immediately get to a data binding. So anything I change here, it's going to change there. Anything, and I apologize for the video people, you can't see where I'm pointing. Anything I change in my JavaScript is going to show in the HTML. Anything I change in the HTML is going to show in the JavaScript. You don't have to do anything. Now, there's a lot of libraries that can do that, right? One of the advantages of Vue, I think, goes back to what we talked about with the performance, right? Vue is intelligent enough to know exactly what part of that HTML down to the text node to re-render when changes happen. There are very, very few Vue, not Vue the framework, but Vue libraries, VIEW libraries, that can claim that.
You talked a little bit about UX modules, and I was reading the documentation for it today, and I was kind of confused because it seemed like without namespacing them, there didn't seem to be any particular advantage considering everything was still globally available as if you were still on the same store, other than perhaps portability between projects. And I was curious as to what advantages you might have seen in your experience for modularizing a UX store versus just keeping it all in the same space, and if that's dependent on namespacing those modules or not.
Yeah, so the question was, as far as Vuex goes, if you break Vuex down into modules and you don't namespace them, is there advantages, or is namespacing really the way to go when you're talking about Vuex modules? So I think if we don't look at namespacing, I think the one advantage you're going to get is readability of your code, right? So what I mean by that is if I have a to-do module and refrigerator module, right? Even if they're still all globally available, and I've got to worry about making sure I don't have namespace, action collisions and those kind of things. Conceptually, if I'm a developer looking at the code, I still know that this all deals with to-dos and this all deals with refrigerators. The same reason why we might use an OOP language, right? Or an object-oriented language and talk about classes. Personally, for me, if I'm using Vuex modules, I always namespace them. I think that the biggest reason I like the namespacing is, one, you don't have to worry about the collisions if you happen to name two actions the same or something like that. But more importantly, you can be very specific in saying that I want it to do, add to do, or refrigerator, add refrigerator. You're very explicit in where in your store things are actually happening. Some might argue that that is a little bit counterintuitive to a store model. And you could probably argue it either way. To me, I think it gives you all the benefits of the store model, but still being able to conceptually decouple it in your head.
What about like third-party JavaScript that we can load on the page? Is there a good way to handle and maintain single place, right? Store all those scripts and put them.
Yeah, sure. So the question was, if you have external libraries, is there a good way to, or third-party libraries, a good way to a central location to kind of store those so that they're injected on the page? So there's a couple options for that. If you were to go the plain old simple route, where you're just importing Vue on the page, you would just import all your JavaScript modules the same way. For a very, very small application, that might work. Instead, what I would recommend for any large application is use a tool that's available. Webpack is a great example, right? Webpack is what a lot of people use. With Webpack, you have a main entry point for your Vue applications. Typically, it's called a main.js. And And what that's actually going to do is much like the React, I can't think of the name of it, but React, you basically pass it a DOM element and it kind of bootstraps React. Vue has the same idea. But within there, you can fully use the import system within Webpack. So let's say you want jQuery. Okay, well, let's just use your npm, install jQuery into as your package dependency, and then just within your main.js, import jQuery. Now you have jQuery fully available within your application, anywhere that you want to use it, and you've got the dependency management system with npm, which, or Yarn, which is on top of npm if that's what you want to use. You've gotten a single central location where you can see all your dependencies. And Webpack and Vue Loader will take care of actually pulling that out and putting it in the resultant JavaScript files for you and automatically building all your HTML. So Vue Loader will do a lot of that stuff for you. It will also do things like manifest files and hash mapping and splitting your JavaScript. So if you're using something like HTTP2, you can have multiple JavaScript files and duplex them down and really get that kind of level of performance. So if you're using Vue Loader and Webpack, there's a lot of power there to be able to do those kind of things.
What if any, limitations have you come across with Vue? This compared to, say, something where you would still reach for either vanilla JavaScript over Vue or jQuery or something else, somewhere where you think, yeah, Vue doesn't really do this well or does this at all.
Okay, so the question was, what are the limitations of Vue compared to maybe vanilla JavaScript, or when would I maybe reach for that as opposed to Vue? I think Vue, like a lot of frameworks, they're great for, I'll call them CRUD apps, right? So your typical line of business apps, some of those kind of things. Now, if you're going to really get into a gaming app, or you really need, that super high fine-grained level of performance, that might be a case where you want to drop down to plain JavaScript. Or you may learn the innards of React, and React, Vue out of the box is great. There's certainly ways to make it more performant, but if you're looking at, you really want to get kind of hardcore into the weeds and really make it super performant for like a game, or I don't want to say a real-time app because Vue can handle most real-time fine, but let's say a real-time app that's handling hundreds of thousands of messages a second, okay? Those are some times where maybe Vue might break down a little bit, especially if using Vuex. That's a lot of things that are firing. And that's a case where you might want to go plain JavaScript because you really want to get down in the weeds and really code it. That's something where you might use, what is it, ESM. There's a JavaScript thing that's kind of becoming a little more popular. It's kind of somewhat assembly language-ish, where you really can get kind of super performance. So that might be an example of that. Or like I said, React, there are ways to make React super performant if you really get in the weeds, and probably in some cases make it more performant than Vue. So.
How does Vue have any way to handle like synchronizing the server database somehow, like making sure it's consistent?
So the question was, does Vue have any way built in to synchronize with like a server database? Built in, no. There's ways that you could achieve it. So if you were to, let's say, to use something like WebSockets or CommonD or something like that, where you're pushing data down to the client, you can certainly write those wrappers in to keep that data consistent. In fact, this is where Vuex might shine, because with Vuex you could write a plugin or write a middleware that kind of listens to those messages and communicates back and forth, feeds it into your store, and then your store is going to populate that data back out to your application. So, like, is there just a couple, kind of things you could use built in? No, but it is something you certainly could build within the ecosystem, I think, fairly easily.
Do they have any sort of there's React Native? Do they have any sort of pipeline?
Question was, is there any anything like React Native for Vue? I believe that there is. I think, but I don't have a definitive answer for that, and I will definitely look into it. Yeah, so I don't have a definitive answer, but something we can definitely look into.
For what it's worth on that topic, Alibaba, the largest e-commerce company in China, they run all of their e-commerce, like all of their mobile apps. They build a sort of native JavaScript compiler, sort of like React Native that is based on Vue called Weeks. The only trouble with using that in production in the United States is that their documentation isn't great in English. I mean, it might be serviceable depending on how complex of an app you want to build, but if you really want to get close to the metal, then you're probably going to run into some difficulties with just the language barrier. But I know that MNU, the creator of Vue, and has been working with them to try and make that sort of cross the pond, so to speak, because that's a big stumbling block for a lot of people looking at Vue versus React. But there are also still, there are a number of, native script is still working on and has some working version of Vue integration right now. And of course, there's still stuff like Cordova.
Yeah, and I don't know. I haven't looked into Ionic in a while. I knew they were big Angular, but it wouldn't surprise me if they built something in there, something like that to use. Anything else? All right, awesome. So I will link up the code that I wrote for tonight. I didn't know if we were going to get through it or not. It doesn't look like we will. So if you want to stick after for a couple minutes, I got a couple minutes. I got kids home. I'll be more than happy to show it to you real quick. But we'll kind of go ahead and end up here and stick around. So, Jacob,
let's give Chuck a round of applause.
Yes.